3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.
There is no other institution that has the ability, uniquely,
without a heritage, every generation starts over.
To remind the current regime
what your country.
We, the people, tell the government what it is allowed to do.
To get back in their box and stay there.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
From the Heritage Foundation, this is Heritage Explains.
George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr. These names are hopefully familiar to just about every kid growing up in the United States of America. They're individuals who shaped the times that they lived in, whose impact has trickled down even to the present day. We remember them in order to understand how our country has developed over time, but also to learn from them as people, exceptional individuals that they were. Sometimes they demonstrated tremendous virtue, and other times they showed weakness and vice. But it would be a mistake to only learn from these great figures of national history. We also have to turn to the personal, to the uncles, aunts, parents, and grandparents who have much to teach us from their own pasts. One such example is Andre Joseph Scheinmann. Although his name doesn't have the same reach as George Washington, his story is a truly remarkable one. Heritage Vice President Victoria Coates sat down with author Diana Mara Henry and Dr. Gabriel Scheinmann, president of the Alexander Hamilton Society and grandson of Andre Joseph Scheinmann, to hear some of that story.
Welcome to a very special edition of Heritage Explains. I'm Victoria Coates. I'm joined today by Gabriel Scheinmann and Diana Mara Henry, who have collaborated on a really extraordinary book called I Am Andre, a German Jew, French resistance fighter, and British spy, which is about the life of Andre Joseph Scheinmann, who is Gabe's grandfather, and was extremely active, as you can tell from that title, across a range of activities in World War II. And I was personally very eager to do this podcast because my grandfather, Howard Allen Downey, was a captain in the U.S. Army who was part of the D-Day invasion and then fought his way across Europe during 1944 and 1945. And we have all of his letters, and which we've gathered together. So these really can be very personal journeys into that fascinating, very searing period of history. To see them through one person's eyes and experiences is, I think, really the essence of history. So this is our opportunity to talk to both Diana and Gabe about their knowledge of Andre, how they came to write the book, and what our listeners can expect to learn from it. So Gabe and Diana, welcome to Heritage.
Thank you, Victoria.
And I really want this... Thank you. And I really want this to be your opportunity to tell us some of those critical stories. So I thought, Diana, I might actually ask you first how you came to know Andre and how you came to write this book.
Well, I'd been studying the Nazi concentration camp since I first visited it in 1985. And I tell people I never left. In 1994, I was preparing for my 25th college reunion, and I remember I was standing at the at the window to watch for the cab that was going to take me back to Cambridge and Massachusetts from California, and I got a phone call from, as it turned out, Michel Scheinmann, who I had never met at college. But he said, if you're coming to the reunion, I'd very much like you to meet my father, that is Andre, who was a camper at Natzweiler, the concentration camp in Alsace that I visited in 1985 and been studying ever since. So that's how I met Andre, is when I went to our Harvard-Radcliffe reunion. Michel invited me to meet his father, and his father shared his memoir with me. And it was so powerful and interesting and unique, I thought, that I offered to help see it published.
Well, and Gabe, can you talk a little bit about how you came to know your grandfather's autobiography or memoirs, and then how you participated in the project?
So my grandfather, I was 15 when my grandfather passed away. And he, in the last few years of his life, was in a lot of actually physical pain as well, even though mentally all there. And as a kid, I was always aware, or at least I was told, that he was a Holocaust survivor. That was what I sort of knew. And I don't want to say that. I mean, there aren't too many survivors in the first place, but it wasn't, let's call it, an unusual sort of story within the Jewish community in America to be a grandson of a Holocaust survivor. See, I hate to put it that way. But only in the last couple years of his life, and frankly, after he met Diana and they started working on this project together, did he start actually giving public talks on it. He really didn't talk about it much, his wartime experience at all. Internally, I think my dad knew a good chunk of it, but that was about it. And then only in the last few years, he started giving a talk at a Hillel or at some cultural institution that mattered. And I remember going to a couple of these when I was 13, 14, and I said, wait a minute. This is actually a very different story. Then again, I don't want to downplay it by saying simply a Holocaust survivor story, but it's a totally different story. One where he, at various points in his life during the war at a very young age, chose to fight rather than flee. One that is not simply of him as a victim, but also as a hero. And so I just remember these stories. And then it wasn't really until much further when Diana really took his story, his memoir, and turned it into this book, into her book, and all the research that she has done to undergird it and connect my grandfather's individual story into, he shows up in a lot of other people's stories too, that I feel actually learned so much more about it. And use it as an inspiration, I think, for some of I hate to say it, but some of the era that we're actually entering in today. So Diana really has taken this singular story, to your point, it's through the lens of an individual, but I think helped turn it into something that represents a much greater example to some of the things that we ought to be doing today.
Well, and as our listeners, get the book and start going through it, you'll find that it's text, but it's almost like a scrapbook, filled with clippings and primary documentation, and you really get a very physical sense of what Andre went through. And let's start in with Andre. How did he come to join the French resistance? What was his path to come to that particular the company that he was in and the role that he played? Maybe start with you, Diana.
Sure. Well, he fought for France during the year 1939 to 1940, before France was overrun by the Germans, and ended up in a prisoner of war camp in Brittany. And in his first act of daring do, I suppose, he got a forger, also a prisoner of war, to forge his release documents from the prisoner of war camp, because he very much didn't want to be taken to Germany to be a prisoner of war in Germany. So the book, his memoir talks about how he managed to, escape from prisoner of war camp with these forged documents. And he was not known to be Jewish at the time or ever for the rest of the war. So he went to seek employment, and something came up, which was to be a translator for the head of French National Railroads in Brittany, at the Brittany hub. And the purpose of his translation was to facilitate communication with the German high command that was using the railroads for the exploitation of French industrial and agricultural products, and also for bringing troops and materiel to build submarine bases and fuel depots, and to furnish the airfields that the Germans had taken over in France. And Andre became a very trusted interpreter for his boss, who was already in an MI6 network. And then for the Germans, who really liked him very much and asked for him to join them on inspection tours of northern France. And so he reluctantly, very reluctantly, told them that they'd have to check with his boss because he, had a job, of course, and wasn't working for them. And then his boss would reluctantly, very reluctantly, and all of this was a play, agree to let his trusted interpreter go with him. So Andre had really extremely strategic information, which went to England, to MI6. That's how he became involved. And then the other networks, the smaller networks that had been created as soon as the German occupation began, they began to hear of Andre and that he had a connection with London. And so he eventually aggregated about a dozen of the smaller networks in Brittany, the very first networks that funneled information to him also for teenage girls bicycling along the coast, taking pictures, a whole host of fascinating characters and patriots who sent their information to London, not really knowing, I think, most of them, whether they were sending it to de Gaulle or to, I think they would have been surprised to know it was going to MI6. But it got there, and he provided such a valuable service that in January 1942, he was taken across the channel to London to meet with his MI6 bosses, and they furnished him with 500,000 French francs to create 2 new networks. So that's his career up to that time.
Yeah, I found all of the material you had on how intelligence was collected during this period fascinating, because for those of us who have served in government and we know, the way we are collecting intelligence in 2024 is a radically different thing. And, the human investment in getting this information, I found really extraordinary. One of my favorite stories was when he was talking about how he would gather information about the damage the Germans were taking in various raids, and that he would go to the barbershop where the pilots would go to get shaves and massages or whatever after a raid, and collect information that way. Anything stand out for you, Gabe, about his time, as the British spy, essentially? I mean,
Diana mentioned it, but the thing that's there for me is, my grandfather vis-a-vis the Germans was a double traitor, right? He was German. He was born in Germany, spent almost the first 18 years of his life before his family left to move to France. His father, my great-grandfather, was a bit of an anti-Hitler activist, and so they sort of saw the writing on the wall and left. So, a German fighting German army is a traitor in the first place. And then obviously he's a Jew. And so it's not just taking great risk to do, to your point, this kind of human intelligence collection, or as a spy reporting to the British, helping, feed information to sabotage, but at great personal risk to him, not just as any sort of, Frenchman, but one, if his true identity were revealed, it would have been death. I think it would have been certain death in that way. And so what stands out for me about his story is, I love the little vignettes, kind of things that do that, but it's also as a 25-year-old, which is basically what he was at the time, to be able to take on, seemingly without much hesitation, without really thinking too deeply about it, take on these fights. It's so great personal risk compared to, what would I have been able to do at the age of 25? There's no way. There's no way. And so that's really what stands out for me for his time, first at war, and then having joined in this resistance network over the course of a year and a half before, as where Diana kind of left off, before he was basically betrayed and captured. And that's what ends up happening the rest of the war.
Well, and we'll get into that, but I think that's critical for our listeners, that this really is an inspirational book about the triumph of the human spirit, but then just pure raw courage. to, in the face of what seems like insurmountable odds, take on this fight and not be willing to sort of cave in to the Nazis or give up, but rather to always stand. And that was really one of the very powerful themes, I think, of the next phase of the book when he is betrayed and captured, but then never ever just accepts his fate and is always organizing his fellow prisoners, doing things to try to give a sense of normalcy to that most abnormal of existences. So, Diana, can you talk a little bit about what happened to him that led to his imprisonment?
Well, he was, as I mentioned, implicated as the head of a lot of different networks, and eventually those networks began to be betrayed. And so the last one that was betrayed that really affected him the most, I think, was the George France network, which was known during the war as Group 31, an SIS network. And it was brought down in October of 1941. But as we can see from his arrest only at the beginning of February of 42, the Germans, the Abwehr, the military intelligence, let him and his boss sort of run so that they could, I guess, find more people. And eventually, when he went to England, he went with the first association he had up to that time with the Gaulle network. It was a BCRA network, which was the de Gaulle Secret Intelligence Network. And he went across the channel, of course, with a British Special Operations executive that was facilitating de Gaulle's secret intelligence. And but when he got to England, he got off the boat and they were ready to sweep them all up into, de Gaulle's orbit. And he said, no, I want to work with the British. I've been working with them up until now, and that's who I'm working with from now on. And so he did undergo sabotage and codes and secret killing probably, although he never talked about killing anyone, training with the British. And but the members of the BCRA, of the de Gaulle network that he had come across with, they were betrayed by the very notorious traitor Lachat, double-agent Victoire, who had been infiltrated into the de Gaulle network as a secretary. And so when they returned, they were all within a few days picked up. Andre, of course, first had secreted the $500,000 franc bankroll that the British had given him to start his new network, and he had hidden all of his other information. So that when he was picked up, he went back to his work at the railroads, and he walked in. Although he had been warned that his network had been his boss had been arrested and many others, but he thought, well, it's going to be a bad time, but I will prevail. I will fool them again, and I will go on even stronger, which he admits was his first error in, having so much bravado about it. And he went in and he said their eyes flew open, and he was immediately arrested by the Gestapo and then sent to, the Gestapo prisons in France, where he was interned for 18 months and subjected to many interrogations and brutalization and solitary confinement, but never revealed anything, as his Legion of Honor and Army Corps citations all acknowledge from the French government. They never got anything from him, except that he did admit that he'd gone to London. He said to check on a girlfriend. So, but he didn't reveal anything, because he said if the people who revealed who they worked with, when they got the information, the Germans would tell them their usefulness was exhausted. So he realized that for his own protection, as well as that of all his cherished comrades, that he was not going to reveal anything, nor did he.
It's just extraordinary story. And, as difficult as it is to talk about, and, you said, Gabe, you don't want him to be just a concentration camp survivor. But given what we've seen, particularly over the course of the last year, it must be said, the reality of what was experienced in those camps has to be documented. And I know, Diana, this has been your life's work, but Gabe, can you talk a little bit about, what he experienced in the concentration camps and how extraordinary his survival was?
Diana would know, obviously, because she really studied this more so than I did. And the couple things I would remember, frankly, from my grandfather talking a little bit about these experiences, sort of the, dark humor or gallows humor that the people who did survive sort of had about himself. And my grandfather was always a bit of a kind of wry, humorous guy, self-effacing, humble, but with air, and just sort of the things that they would do to sort of make sure that the weakest amongst them had enough bread or water to be able to survive the next day or the next week, or understanding that the goal was to be able to survive, and which was not an easy one, and stories about how he'd fake things by taking a potato from his ration and carving out a stamp in it with ink to be able to try and forge different documents to be able to do more things. It's just stories I held. So, I'll throw it to Diana a bit, because she would probably know more of the specifics, especially in Natzweiler. Natzweiler is a camp that most people have never heard of. Dachau, which is where he ended up, people know that name, but Natzweiler, and Diana obviously is really the expert on this. And so, Dan, I'll throw it to you. You probably have it in more granular detail than I do.
Yeah, well, Natzweiler was a camp that was specifically for non-Jews by decree of the SS headquarters at Oranienburg, which was their high command. And so, many people don't know that actually there was a decree in the fall of 1942, in October 5th of 1942, that all the concentration camps on Reich territory should be emptied of their Jews who were to be sent to the extermination camps in Poland. And so from then on, and Reich territory included Alsace, which today is considered France, but is France. But when the Germans took it back from France in 1940, they took it back into the civic government of Germany. And so Andre, of course, was a secret Jew there, as there were many political prisoners like him. They were Nacht and Nebel prisoners, night and fog prisoners, meant to disappear as a way to terrorize the population, because their families and friends and associates would not know what had become of them. So Hitler imagined that this would be more terrifying even than public executions, which had been, the fate of political prisoners or enemies of the Reich until then. And so the Nazi Nebel prisoners were more harshly treated than even the others in these camps. And Andre became an interpreter again, which he didn't want to do. He didn't want to do anything to help the Germans, but they were lined up when they first arrived, and he was in their transport of Nazi Nebel prisoners, the first from France, in July of 1943. He was he was with about 12 members of his network. And the German commandant said, who's the interpreter among you? And no one stepped forward. And the commandant said, well, if no one steps forward, I am going to shoot 5 of you immediately. And so his pals pushed him and said, Andre, better you than us. And so he stepped forward, and from then on he became, an interpreter for the French to try to, help the Germans manage the French prisoners who were not always very compliant. And so Andre had a very difficult role in the camps because he had to try to get his comrades to comply as a way to save what they could to save their lives. Because he faced the reality, which a lot of them didn't want to face, that the commandant said the only way you're going to leave here is up the chimney, which meant they would be, killed and burned. And, he told them, we've got to make it through. And in fact, they did. They, as Gabe said, they promised each other, if we're the last one, we're going to see the end of this Reich, which Hitler wanted to last for 1,000 years and only lasted for 12, as it turned out. In great part because of the courage of many people like Andre.
Oh, absolutely. And sort of last questions here are about what happened after liberation and, the very moving accounts of how the physical toll of his incarceration, stayed with him for the rest of his life. So it's not something you can ever kind of move past because it's always with you. But Gabe, do you want to talk a little bit about your experiences with your grandfather over the last 15 years of his life and how you would like this story to influence a current audience?
Yeah, I mean, like I said earlier, I was 15 when he passed away, and he passed away at the age of 86. And so even from when I was born, he was always an elderly grandfather, let's say, put it that way. And after a certain number of years, even stopped driving and was really in a lot of pain, a couple hip replacement surgeries, among other things. But the thing that always struck me, which I clearly as a child I probably regretted because I never really got to spend a lot of time talking directly with him about these stories, but that his whole story is that it was unassuming. He didn't beat his chest about his wartime service and wartime experience. He didn't consider it abnormal. In his mind, this is what you are supposed to do. There's a quote. I forget if it's at the very end of the book or the very end of his memoir section, where basically he says, I wasn't doing it as a Jew because the Nazis were trying to exterminate the Jew. I was doing it because, for as you put it, sort of for human freedom, for the West, for a normal, sane society. And I wish that was a mindset that we just had more of today, because it's a unifying one. It's a basic one, or at least should be a unifying one. That doesn't mean that everybody needs to gallivant off into war and do these things, but if we embodied, let's say, the values that he stood for, never give up, believe people the things that they say. I mean, there were a lot of people, obviously, at that time who, whether it was about Hitler or whatever, just said, it's bravado. We don't have to believe it in that way. But just standing up for what's right in that way. And then I'll tell a small story on this, which is when I was in college, we were in France, and I visited the French had just reopened in Paris their equivalent, let's call it, of their Holocaust archives, let's call it. And you go into it, and we found on microfiche the actual deportation orders for my great-grandparents, Andre's parents, Max and Regina, who had when the war, Diana might know the exact date, but when the war started, basically moved into Paris. We're told that, at some point there was going to be a roundup of Jews in Paris. They sort of said they didn't believe it, or there wasn't the urgency of it. And they were rounded up in July 1942 in Rafle, which is a very well-known, taken out to Paris, and ultimately to Auschwitz, where they were killed, where they were exterminated. But in those deportation orders, my great-grandfather, my great-grandmother, in the same handwriting next door, their names were spelled, the last names were spelled differently from one another. And they're German, and it's German last names. And so you know this, it hits you when you see this, which is the only way somebody with the same handwriting could have written different is if they were not German. Because if they were German, they would have known it. And so it's clearly a French policeman or soldier or whatever it was. And that's where it hit homes, where the choice between collaborating, which is clearly what that person and much sadly of the French state did in that war, versus someone like my grandfather in that way. And that choice, that sort of really stark choice about what you can do is one that faced a lot of people, and some people made the right one and some people made the wrong one. And again, sadly, because I think of a lot of the era that we're living in today, we will be forced to make a lot more of those choices in the years to come.
No, I think that is unfortunately the reality that we're facing, which is why it's so important that folks do read this book and learn these stories. And Diana, we heard a little bit about why you wrote the book. Can you give our listeners a little bit about why they should want to read the book?
Well, I agree completely with Gabriel that it is really it's really a great I think encouragement to see that one person and many people, in fact, acting on their convictions of what is right and true and good in the world can change the course of history. And, when people look today at the Jewish fighters for the state of Israel, for its existence, and they sort of, one sometimes thinks, well, do they really want the Jews to go back to like sheep to the slaughter, which is the way they were described during the Holocaust? Or, do they want to accept that Jews also want to survive and to thrive and care about their children? So I think that there's, there's a question to be asked about the fighting Jews in this book, like Andre, like his father, who was in World War II fighting for the Germans, like his great uncles who were in the high officers in the Polish army. Why is it okay for Jews to fight for other countries, which have given them asylum for a short time maybe, but still have allowed them to be part of their society? Why is it not okay for Jews to fight for their homeland? So I think there are questions that maybe people will ask themselves in a different way when they read this inspiring story about how Andre contributed to the freedom of France and Europe eventually.
Well, and I think that is why this is such an extraordinarily timely book. And in some ways it is timeless. It's an amazing human story, but it's very timely in its lessons for our world after the October 7th, 2023 attacks and what's been revealed to be here in the United States as well as on the streets of Europe, and why this demands a similarly brave, I think, response from our current generation. So Gabe, Diana, thank you so much for your time today, for sharing Andre's story with our listeners. I, again, strongly recommend the book. It's available on Amazon and Barnes & Nobles, wherever you get your books. It's called I Am Andre, German Jew, French Resistance Fighter, and British Spy. Thank you.
Thank you to Victoria Coates, Diana Mara Henry, and Dr. Gabriel Scheinmann for their contributions to today's episode. You can find links to the Alexander Hamilton Society, as well as to Diana's book, I Am Andre, in the show notes below. And of course, thanks as always to you for listening to Heritage Explains. You can reach out to us with any thoughts, questions, or suggestions at heritageexplains@heritage.org. Take care. We'll see you next time.
Heritage Explains is written and produced by Mark Gagne, Lauren Evans, and John Popp.